Hello, everybody. Looks like we're live. It's hard to believe that we're nearing the final days and hours of the Connected Learning Summit, which has occupied a lot of our attention for a lot of July. It's been really exciting to see the range of different programs and topics and the community that's convened in this very new format for us that was stretched over the course of the month. And I'm just super delighted to be able to welcome and introduce our keynote who this is sort of, given our two time zone model, the closing keynote for the later time zones for the Connected Learning Summit. And I'm particularly delighted to be able to introduce a fellow digital anthropologist. I'm Mimi Ito. I direct the Connected Learning Lab, and I am also a cultural anthropologist of digital youth culture like Crystal is. And I have not been able to do my own frontlines field work and hang out with kids on the internet as I did early in my career. And it's just really, really great to see all of the original work that Crystal has been doing in this space. I'm a huge fan, and really jealous of the fact that she's been able to do such amazing field work on the current trends in internet culture. And I'm sure you'll be hearing about. You can read Crystal's bio and her amazing accolades and awards that she's received for our work. So I won't bore you with all of those details because I know you're eager to hear directly from Crystal rather than me. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Crystal.
Me. Good morning, everyone, or at least good morning from my continent. I'm very excited to be here with you. And thank you for giving me a moment of your day to share a bit of my research. So without further ado, this is TikTok, youth cultures, and the East Asian industry. To start off, let me tell you just a bit about myself. So as Mimi has introduced, I am a digital anthropologist of influencer cultures, focusing on internet celebrity and social media pop cultures. The very first time I ever encountered anything to do with this field, I was just an undergrad between the years of about 2007 and 2008. I was one of those young, enthusiastic students who took up a lot of higher degree modules, and in being able to do my own original research for the first time, I had looked into a phenomenon known as blog shops. Now, at that time, what would eventually become generations and cohorts of influencers was actually groups of young women from the ages of about 13 to 18 who took to online blogs like LiveJournal, Open Diary, Zanga, Angel Fire to share pictures of themselves wearing clothing and wearing fashion outfits out with their friends. The main idea here of blog shops was that they turned blogs into shops, simply by modeling their clothes and trying to sell their secondhand clothes online. This was also a period of time where blog shops were striving and competing against flea markets that were increasing in cost for rentals. On my research, then, a 1 meter by 1 meter table that used to cost about $15 could go all the way up to $250 for that same real estate. So that was the very beginnings of what would become influencer cultures, as these young girls who first started out as models eventually evolved into role models and leaders in their respective genres. This research took me to very interesting places, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, as I focused on my honors, looking at how these clothes traveled from one country to another country across different vintage markets, flea markets, and online stores, and as well as very different circuits of production, where young women would travel, say, all the way to Bangkok with 2 empty suitcases, come back with lots of clothes from shops like MBK Shopping Mall or Chatuchak Market, come back home, set up stall, and talk about how all of this was specially imported, which was really code for them taking a discount flight somewhere across Southeast Asia, buying a lot of things in bulk, and then selling them. But soon this really evolved into a very mature economy where a lot of these young women began producing their own clothes and they ended up becoming fashion entrepreneurs. That took me to my PhD research just here. I had moved to Australia and started focusing on the Asia Pacific region at large. And by these times, a lot of these bloggers, Instagrammers, YouTubers began to be conceptualized as micro celebrity and influencers. So I paid special attention to one level up from the everyday, from people, from the community, to looking at regions and flows, such as mega regional awards shows for influencers that started off as early as in the mid 2010s, as well as all these flows of online comments, haters, trolls, troll armies that you could probably also hire for pay across the country, whether to boost or to bring an influencer down. In my first postdoc, I spent more time in Singapore committing to research in this area, looking specifically at how these influencers started to rise, but also really became close to millionaires in the way that they were working with partners and companies. That was very exciting. I wanted to take this up a further level, and in my second postdoc, I moved to Sweden, focusing on the influencer industry in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, this time focused on the level of agencies. I got to interview lots of incubators, lots of agencies who were talent scouting and grooming influencers, visited tons of production houses, was also super lucky to visit a lot of major fashion brands who had their own in-house production units where they tried to groom influencers in-house from scratch. Because presumably, if you got someone from scratch and molded them, as opposed to having someone parachute in, they're brand safe and clean, and you get to write their online backstory. So that took me to that research studying networks of agencies. In recent years since 2019, I am back in my focus looking at the Asia Pacific region and now more closely looking at cultural East Asia. In these two slides, you see snippets of my Australian Research Council project, that's 3 years plus another 2 years with thanks to my university, looking more closely at how within Asia, across Asia, and from Asia to elsewhere, influencer logics, talents, ethos, businesses are growing, blooming, and also blending. So it is in this context that I want to explain the influencer industry and then situate my latest work on TikTok. Here's where we're going to go today. After that 5-minute cap of maybe what would have been a very good 14 years of my life thus far, I want to talk us through some key concepts about influencers because there are a lot of misconceptions of who they are, who they should be, what they do for a living. I want to highlight some context about the East Asian region, highlight some specific things and considerations about TikTok, highlight some visibility practices and labels on TikTok, talk about how activism is done on TikTok compared to other apps, and end off with a case study looking at anti-Asian racism. So, what is an influencer anyway? This is always a cheeky question I ask every time I'm in a physical space and get people to respond to me, but I'm not going to put you through this in a live screen and respond to yourself. Well, we have this conception that influencers are generally young women, that they're generally in the genres of lifestyle, fashion, and beauty, and that they're probably earning a lot of money. And this is a combination of 3 factors. One, historically, women did start off the influencer industry. In parts of the world like Australia and in Sweden, it was the mummy parental bloggers who kicked off the scene. And as I've intimated before in Southeast Asia, it was these young high schoolers and college girls who started that industry. Elsewhere in the US, we've had accounts from media scholars like Teresa Senft about cam girls who were videoing themselves from their bedrooms. And that seemed to be the origin story of the influencer industry. So historically, we think of influencers as women. Secondly, though, this misconception is largely a practice of politics. A lot of men, and certainly there are so many men in the influencer industry, may not be in the front lines, but so many of them are in the back end owning agencies, grooming influencers, really controlling the purse strings. So men are very visible in the industry, but perhaps not always on the front lines as the face of the influencer or a brand. This is perhaps the most clear, as in the last 3 to 4 years, we started focusing more on virtual influencers, realizing that some of the most beautiful women of color VR figures around the world were really augmented and created by white men, mostly from the global north. Now, I need to highlight here that a lot of these men who are influencers also don't tend to associate themselves with this vocabulary, instead believing that they might be more suited to the term creator. This is a matter of genre as well as politics. Many influencers who started out personalizing their stories using their lifestyles belong to genres that lended well to that format. Lifestyle, parenting, cosmetics, health, beauty, fashion. Things that really require adornment of your body, but also require you to put out personal stories and narratives in order for people to feel rapport with you. A lot of men belong, though, to genres where they create or make something that is more externalized. A video game, a tech object or practice, comedy and humor online, and it feels more like they are makers of a thing. And therefore, when we think about stigma, abuse, trolling in the industry, a lot of the comments to women influencers are really cutting about themselves and their backgrounds, whereas some of the critique that goes in the way of male creators tends to just focus on the craft. There are, of course, genres and platforms where this gets blurred. Think, for instance, about the live streaming space, say on Twitch, where if a man who doesn't present as very hegemonically masculine comes up and plays a game, he may be respected for his craft. But if they're a lifestyle streamer conducting mukbang, eating, then there's the gray area where they seem to be adopting the elements and performative practices of women influencers in this space. And that's where you see some of the backlash towards them or some of the harsh critical comments. The third thing I want to really clarify before we move into this space is that the term influencer is also a matter of platform ecology. Back in the days, before the TikTok Creator Fund, before YouTube partnership programs became accessible, to be called an influencer represented that you were also an entrepreneur, that you might have been a one-man show, you might have been created by an agency, but you are running an online business. These days, though, given that a lot of people are now using platforms and making a living, the platforms themselves are trying to extrapolate some of this value by calling in partners, creator funds, and trying to give people some income in this space. And naming these folks creators makes them part of the platform ecology, kind of like gig workers, as opposed to influencers who stand out and happen to use a multitude of platforms to build their brand. So there you have it, a matter of history and legacy, a matter of gender politics, and a matter of platform ecology. I know this is not really the focus of the talk, but I felt very strongly needing to stress this, given that this is a very wide and interdisciplinary audience, and I'd love to be able to dialogue on these issues based on your standpoint. I'm going to run through some very key concepts quite briefly now, just to orientate us around how others can think about influencers and what other elements to consider. Influencers are a subgenre of internet celebrity. Internet celebrities comprise many different types of people and artifacts, and they mainly have high visibility online. You see there in orange what the morality or the quality of the visibility can be attributed to. So think about people who are the face of memes, people who've gone viral, whether unwittingly or by design, people whom you might know one off in a TikTok and then fade into oblivion, versus influencers who really strive to maintain their fame. All of these people are technically internet celebrities. The duration, the quality, the reason for their fame may vary, but influencers tend to one side of these moral pairs, the ones that are bolded and in orange, because come together, these elements allow influencers to push for a sustained career to monetize themselves as internet celebrities. Here are 4 quick qualities that most internet celebrities have, or to put it another way, the 4 qualities that we seem most exposed to or most enjoyable whenever we feel that something has caught our eyes. Exclusivity, relating to economic capital; everydayness, relating to social capital; exceptionalism, relating to technical capital; and exoticism, relating to cultural capital. One more thing to note. A lot of people often ask me, how many people do you need to have following you to be a real influencer? This is a super tenuous question, and as an anthropologist, again, I point you back to culture. What context are we speaking out of? In my research in the Nordic countries, given that they're all really small countries with a smaller internet population, a mega influencer may just be someone who's got followers in the ranks of over 1 million. But if I were to scale this to Asia, where there are super mega countries like China as well as India, 10 million may not even cut it. So we need to scale our understandings of mega to nano influencers in terms of how big a demographic is, not just in terms of country, also in terms of the platform size, and sometimes even the size of the genre. So in brief, if we were to tailor make the 3 functions of influencers, those in the mega tier, we can think of them as amplifiers of information. At some point, they can sometimes rival broadcast media in their reach, but they're here just to get information into them, get information out there. The most conservative influencers in the mid tier, we can consider them opinion leaders. Unlike the amplifiers, they might be more narrow in their genre, have a more target audience, and there is a lot of persuasion work happening where they try to craft their leadership in these areas. But there's also room for micro and nano influencers who depend on the smaller, more intimate networks to do word of mouth conversions. All of these people are influencers. They may not have the same impact, but they also do not suffer the same consequences every time there's a headline of a YouTuber doing something really silly or another influencer committing fraud, and trust in this industry is destabilized. So I do want us to keep in mind that, like society in general, there is the top 1%, there is a long tail working hard, and there is a super long tail of people working hard aspirationally to make it. And so when we think about the influencer, that diversity is important. This long tail that I've just mentioned is especially important for the context of TikTok, which is rich with micro and nano influencers who have different types of impact, and that we will get into in a while. As a minor note, I also want to explain that in this research, I have mostly focused from the back end to the front end, the early to the late life cycle. So these would be people who are just starting out, including people who are ready to retire or people who are made to leave. But in this 12 to 13 years so far, if there's one thing I need to highlight, it is that the way we think about the influencer has changed. In the first generation of our studies, we used to focus on influencers as a culture of practice. What do they used to do? Why do we feel parasocial relations to them? What even is authenticity that many people seem to be writing about? And we try to figure and doing things online, on screen, which of course now is an everyday practice given that we're all on Zoom. In the second generation, we conceptualize influencers as a concept and a role. What is their place in society when they commit faux pas and millions of young people tune into them? When they are involved in less than savory politics? When they're here and they rival the numbers of the mainstream media and politicians? Are they just entertainment? Do we consider them leaders? What if all they're showing us are gameplays and fashion? Is that important? And so these were the big types of questions we were asking. Now, in the third generation, in the era of fake news and misinformation, we really do need to think of influencers as amplification platforms. In one of my forthcoming books, my favorite way to think of influencers is that they're experts in science communication. In the same way that people who work in science communication brainstorm over the best way to dish out a message to their audience, influencers are experts at cutting through all the white noise and saturation of our internet society to get a message to their target audience. Now, the way that they do that, the vehicle that they use, might be a combination of humor, intimacy, relatability, maybe even scandal and virality. But the fact of the matter is they get that message out there, whether it's to promote to you cat food, hair conditioner, or a political opinion. That's been the summary of influencers and internet celebrity, which I feel is important in order for us to understand how TikTok has come about. And now I'm really excited to move on to the context in which TikTok has emerged. What is so specific about the East Asian region, apart from the fact that many of the commentators in the Olympics seem to be mixing up every other East Asian presenting person in many of the sports? I think we need to keep in mind that in East Asia, there is very rich cultural diversity. Any Asian presenting person like myself, having people coming up to you to go ni hao, and then you having to explain, actually, I'm not really Chinese. That might be your closest approximate, but that's not the culture I identify with. But that rich cultural diversity cannot be easily captured by just the visuality of internet cultures, because it's hard for the people with unacquainted eyes to tell apart phenotype, to tell apart language, to tell apart digital cultures. And that was what made my research really exciting, especially when I was trying to split fine hair between the digital cultures of Tokyo and Seoul, Shanghai and Hong Kong and Taipei, and working out the nuances with the different informants I was working with. Secondly, these are also generally countries, alongside many others in the Southeast Asian region, where there is a level of state intervention to the types of media people can engage with, or the types of media and messages people can put out. And for that reason, a lot of digital users in this region are very creative with social steganography, encryption, decryption, code switching, and that is really a hotbed of creativity. Thirdly, I think we need to think about how much innovation, trade, and support is given to the digital economies in these spaces. Countries like South Korea and Hong Kong have dedicated startup spaces that the governments have pumped millions of dollars into to help with innovation, things like digital innovation, structure, 5G. The cost of living in order to access the internet is significantly lowered, or at least made more accessible to the general public. And this is a matter of government design as well as historical legacies of the terrains allowing these infrastructures. Last but not least, despite all of those points, and especially the rich cultural diversity, generally these parts of the world have high socioeconomic status in terms of the average income, or in terms of the average internet user that we see online. So there is a specificity about this region here that has given rise to certain types of TikTok cultures flourishing, as well as certain types of very creative messaging when we talk about activism on a space like TikTok, which has been known for pulling information or for its harsh platform censorship. Here are snippets from a time before the plague where I got to do field work. My last stint was in December 2019. As an anthropologist, I do miss this so much, but I do hope that one day our world will heal and we'll be able to get back to understanding each other a bit more. I want to now give you a very cheeky and brief snapshot about what our internet culture is like today. In brief, I argue that we are moving from an era of network publics to one of refracted publics. Now, my spouse, the person I live with, is a very avid fisherman. And whenever they go fishing, I am bored to my wits. My brain goes wild. All I want to do is go home and write or chill out in front of the TV. And so this allows my thoughts to develop. Whenever they're fishing, though, when they cast something into the water, it looks like they're aiming straight at the fish that they can see. But we understand that with the laws of physics, water acts as a layer that refracts the visuality. So while my person is casting their fishing line here, thinking the fish is here, it's probably displaced by just a bit, right? Each time? Unless you work with something like a scanner or a type of sonogram imagery that you use with like boats when you go boat fishing. If you just rely on what your sight sees, everything is refracted. You think you have access, you think it is transparent, but it's just displaced by a little bit. This is exactly what is happening in our internet culture today. We are in a time where there's perpetual content saturation. We are in a time where there are very hyper-competitive attention economies. Metric cultures are being gamified and datafied, and more importantly, there is a very, very strong culture of information distrust. So what happens here is that when a lot of people, activists, young people, minority groups in the fringes, want to put out messages, they may allow it to physically, logistically be floating in public. But unless you have the wisdom or the tacit knowledge to decode this, you will always be seeing a version of this that's just slightly displaced. And this allows such groups to evade state censorship, platform censorship, seemingly allowing everyone and anyone access, but really they only echolocate and speak to their target audience. So in this era of refracted publics, a lot of our previous conditions like persistence, searchability, replicability, scalability have four added contexts to them. The context of transience, where things go away very quickly, the context of discoverability, as well as silo sociality. While I tend to go into this in depth, I think this is important for us to think about TikTok. TikTok is a social media app unlike any other because it plays very strongly with this idea of refracted publics. When I scroll through my FYP for at least an hour a day for digital ethnography, I have a certain perception of how this app works. I imagine that this is how it works for many other people, but in reality, my algorithm is tailor-made to me, to my geolocation and my digital footprints. Likewise, there are lots of creative ways on TikTok that young people seem to be putting out difficult political messages. A famous example is Feroza Aziz, who appears to be putting together a makeup video and talking about frivolous eyelashes and blush, but in her narration that is deadpan and very serious. She's talking about the Xinjiang genocides happening in China. And we have so many different examples of this. Young women, young people appearing to prepare a tutorial in dance, appearing to do cooking, visually trying to persuade the TikTok algorithm and people who are scrolling that they're doing one thing, when really, if you stay a while, if you wait for a bit to decode the message, there is always a subtext there intended for you. And I think that is a very beautiful way to think about refracted publics on TikTok. Now, TikTok also emerged during the context of COVID-19, and this was very important because prior to that, they actually had a few failures in launching in different countries. To give you an example, in South Korea, when TikTok was first launched, a lot of people, a lot of locals took it as the Chinese app, and due to political sensitivities, it wasn't actually well taken up at all. When it tried again, there were concerns around their privacy. There was a lot of media panic in the news. And this predated all that moral panics coming out of the US and countries trying to ban the app. But when COVID-19 came about and introduced this extended period of self-isolation and boredom across the globe, many influencers from other platforms took the time to learn TikTok and onboard on that space. Many young people who were casually using TikTok turned to it to share their sentiments about being trapped at home for the first time in their entire lives, encountering a regional or even an international crisis. And following from this, many businesses and corporations who wanted to remain relevant started pumping in marketing budgets for digital marketing companies to advertise there. And of course, the turning point would be a lot of major NGOs, community groups like the Red Cross, like UN, like WHO, turning to TikTok in order to push out the correct and safe medical messages about COVID-19. And that was a really important pivot because without this allow, many of the people I've interviewed, many of the veteran influencers I've continued to interview since the late 2000s, told me that they would never have made the effort. It was just too much of an investment. That was a very tricky space. Young people are apparently very scary, but this allowed them that onboarding time. To give you an example of how exactly conversations on TikTok changed, here is a sample of 4 different types of waves that we mapped out as part of an SSRC project, where depending on the news headlines, where the COVID virus was shifting from the Asia Pacific to Europe, to the US, to new conversations, say about voting, vaccines. There were shifts in the discourse just on COVID-19 and TikTok, and each wave introduced new people who were onboarding on the app because they really needed to get into the conversation. A very good example is politicians. When they were really in the space of trying to campaign alongside trying to push for healthy messages, politicians from all around the world were no longer given kudos for just live streaming on Facebook or being on Instagram. The coolest of the lot, who really wanted to reach young people, were shifting to TikTok in this space. And what followed suit was the mainstream media interests, taking this to be a more serious social media space, as opposed to the previous xenophobic and xenophobic clouds and conversations around this app. So that's the context in which TikTok has emerged. But what is so unique about it? I want to usher in 4 main points from my book, hopefully to give you a teaser of what else is to come. Firstly, the features. Everyone has probably already known this by now, but TikTok works with a proprietary algorithm that is very sensitive, microsecond, micro-flicking, micro-action type of sensitivity, and it responds to the last action you've made. So if you've lingered for just a bit too long on that cute puppy video, the algorithm is triggered and tells the app to send you more of such videos. If you see something revulsive, for me, that's snails. I have a terrible phobia of snails, and somehow there are always lots of people on TikTok who rear like giant snails the size of your face. When I see that, I flick away as fast as I can in the hopes that the algorithm never shows me another snail ever. That's case in point, algorithms being very sensitive. We all know that social media is tailor-made and personalized, but the speed and pace at which the TikTok one adjusts just seems to be a bit more sensitive than usual. TikTok also works as a single stream. Unlike moving into, say, Instagram or YouTube, where you open up a page with many different options for posts, TikTok gives you one picture or one video at a time. You don't have the option to switch screens. You don't have the option to go out to another stream of content unless you move to the search function. What you have is just a single stream of content that they feed to you, and that changes the way we think about discoverability and searchability from before when we were talking about refracted publics. Last but not least, sound. This makes me so happy as a musician. Sound has become so central to TikTok as an app. While sound has been available in lots of many different apps like Vine and YouTube and lately Instagram, who seems to be pilfering from every app under the earth, audio memes on TikTok are a way that information is organized. It's a way that people can gain visibility and virality, and it's also an important way for subtext and context mixing to occur. Interventions. Now, one of the very interesting interventions on TikTok is how it has changed the idea of temporality and the relevance of content. Most platforms, certainly especially the ones like YouTube and Instagram, show you the top posts first. If there are posts that been shown weeks ago or months ago, they're archived and you have to scroll and make the effort to get to them. They mainly show you the latest video from each creator. On TikTok though, lots of creators have the opportunity for their videos from months ago, sometimes even early start of the year, to all of a sudden pop up again regardless of relevance. It's a combination of using the right hashtags, but also the TikTok algorithm selecting posts in the past, and therefore everything you've made seems not an archive, but a repository. It is not always ranked by time, and therefore the temporality of how people engage with things you have already made is changed. TikTok is also really clever, learning from the mistakes of Instagram, and they gatekeep commerce. Unlike on, say, Instagram, where you can just start any hashtag and have a brand campaign moving and get people to promote your product for free, engage in hashtag promotions for free. On TikTok, all commercial deals have to go through the official ByteDance partner, whether it's a branded hashtag, a content, or a branded account. And in that way, they're really gatekeeping who gets to pilfer value, monetary value from the platform. It certainly took Instagram years and years to learn this, since from about 2011, Instagrammers were already making money off the app, but it was only around 27 or 18 that Instagram formalized the paid partnerships, whereas TikTok got this right from the start. A very important point to understand about TikTok is its geo-specificity. In short, pretty much every country has very specific TikTok norms. And this is a combination of who the early investors were in each country, who the brand partners were, who the first cohort of users were whenever they entered a new country market and seeded people, and what types of e-commerce were going on. To give you an example, in a space like Japan, TikTok really worked with high schoolers who were first popular on Vine and onboarded them there. And so you see that most of the vernacular and what goes viral in that space is still humor. In a space like South Korea, after those entries that had failed that I talked about earlier, they tend to K-pop. For instance, using the concept of the TikTok stage to bring concerts online in an age where fans could no longer see a lot of their favorite idols in the flesh. Likewise with Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore with influencers. Basically, each country has its own country market, its own TikTok algorithm, a different first cohort of users, and that affects the brand or the flavor of what its norms are. Last but not least, TikTok is also very specific or interesting in terms of its competition. Prior to TikTok, short video apps were a thing. I don't know how else to stress this, especially when I'm speaking to journalists. There's a very rich diversity of different short video app ecologies from all around, even the Asia Pacific. Some of these still have a very strong foothold, for instance, Chingari in India. But the very innovative thing that TikTok did was to borrow from all of these cultures, mostly in the APAC region, and then break into Silicon Valley. So as a researcher tracing apps, it almost feels like what Christine Yano and Koichi Iwambuchi have called the recentering or the decentering of globalization, where the core and the periphery is now moved out of Silicon Valley into the APAC region and then having a secondary node elsewhere in the world. How do people do visibility on TikTok? Now, most of what I'm going to be talking about in this second last section, I've already published about, so allow me to do this in brief. I would love to bring you to the idea of visibility labor, which is the analog labor that a lot of these users engage with in order to be noticeable by two things. One, the human eyeball, so that we pay attention to them, and two, the machine eye, so that the algorithm picks them up and assists in the amplification of their data. I write in this paper about some very interesting circumventions where TikTokers have started trends and norms in order to get people to be hooked onto their contents, to contest who owns a meme or a sound, sometimes interactive practices to get people in touch with them, as well as legacy practices from already established influencers who are now onboarding on TikTok. There are also different movements and different ways that people attract our attention, whether through affect or through impact. A lot of affect was about feelings. You watch something and you know this is something you're aware about, and then you scroll to the next post and it stops there. But there's still many other posts that are about impact. They really cut into what we think. They require some sort of action and intervention. This is perhaps the most important point I want to highlight in this section: streams. TikTok is really like a competitive ecology. Whenever there is one topic, say COVID-19, there may be multiple ways of talking about this issue. Here you see 7. And in each of these 7 streams, they each compete for the best version or the most original discourse that then becomes the mimetic norm, the template for people to make memes after before they emerge as something like the top 7 representing this discourse. Whether this discourse will be talking about anti-Asian racism during COVID-19, about vaccinations, about imaginary travels, or my favorite, about a futuristic dystopia where apparently masks are equated to lingerie, noses have become a sensitive private part, and apparently young people are battling zombies. To move into the very last section, I want to highlight a specific norm on TikTok, that of social justice and anti-racist conversations. Here on TikTok, there is a lot of minority celebrity work going on, where if you happen to belong to an intersectional demographic, the more intersectional, the better, people assign you authority to speak about issues. On the flip side, though, for this reason, a lot of people's identities have been commodified for virtue signaling. Someone who spent a semester in China might suddenly return to the US and claim that they know everything about Asian culture. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of one-upmanship and one-downmanship over whose politics are correct. And more interestingly, the previous influencer logic of who gets to own content and brand it is competing with the mimetic logic of who wants their contents to be spread the furthest and the widest. I want to go ahead now to my very last conversation about anti-Asian racism to highlight 4 things that are happening here on TikTok, but also elsewhere on other apps. Point 1, on TikTok, oftentimes there is a popularity primer that has led to its success. It is affordable. It was available on iOS as well as on Androids. It's portable. It is still right now just a mobile media, not yet available on desktop. It has come in during the time of the post-Instagram bubble, where people were very annoyed and tired out by pristine, picture-perfect middle-classness. And as I said before, because of the COVID-19 self-isolation, a lot of people onboarded onto the app. And so that made it demotic across age and culture. Secondly, as I've mentioned, the platform norm focuses a lot on minority celebrity and intersectional branding. And so the color of your skin, your facial features, any identity markers that you have become social capital, almost to an extrapolated and super emphasized space, more so than in the previous cohorts of influencer commerce elsewhere. Number 3, there are different performance registers that you need to understand and learn, and they include layers of encoding and decoding. For instance, some of these anti-Asian racism posts are a lecture or a tutorial. Others are very sorry confessions and appeals. Others are challenges. Still others are memes and dances. And these are different ways to get the same message out, although in different vernacular and different volumes, thus tending to a very wide audience. And last but not least, there is a pheromonic long tail here on TikTok where your last digital traces linger, and the next time you log onto the app, more of that content is given to you. Pheromones, as we know, affect our sense of smell and how we are attracted to people or things. And in this way, sometimes the ways influencers and TikTokers convey sentiment, communicate intention, create community, or even cause strife affects the emotionality, tonality, and morality of the other content topics that come up to us. So if you're a confession type of girl who only likes confession TikToks, that's what you're going to see more of eventually, even as you look at other contents. That's it from me. Thank you so much for hanging out here. I would like to end off by introducing everyone to the TikTok Cultures Research Network. It's something that I founded in October 2020. We are a network of Asia-Pacific-based scholars who do qualitative research, and we live on TikTokcultures.com. Our next event is in September, and my upcoming book, TikTok and Youth Cultures, will be out in early 2022. Thank you for having me, and I'm going to hand the time back to Mimi.
Thanks so much, Crystal. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed hearing more about your work and the current and emerging trends in TikTok and internet culture. I want to invite everybody. I think we have a few minutes if folks have questions or comments for Crystal. You're welcome to add them to the chat, or also I think Crystal might stick around a little bit for our conversation time afterwards if you want to speak to her directly. I'm happy to kick things off, though, Crystal, if you'll indulge some of my curiosities. Sure. I love the idea of refracted publics, having worked with, Dana on the network publics in a very different era of the internet when, just this idea that these peer-to-peer connections were happening was kind of a big deal at the time. And then, subsequently having done a lot of work, around learning and online communities, where I think it's really striking how, the shift you're suggesting from, just purely network to that kind of refraction where these big platforms and algorithms are sort of at the center and individuals and groups are navigating around that. I think it's a really striking sort of and evocative way of thinking of it. The question I have is, with the connected learning work and, even like our experience this month and trying to convene our community online, a lot of that earlier, it almost feels nostalgic this day now, just speak of internet community as kind of a central trope of my generation of internet studies, and thinking about influence as kind of a new dominant trope within internet culture. It does feel quite different to me, and TikTok is kind of the penultimate um, mobile optimized video platform. I'm curious, like from your vantage point, like whether these ideas of sort of community kind of peer connection and support, are they surviving within this more sort of influencer focused culture? When we talk to young people, they seem to, we have a series of posts around what we're calling spaces of refuge, that young people are retreating to more private spaces for their social support and connection. But I'm curious if, what in that space between influencers and what we call spaces of refuge or full-time intimate communities, is there a place for community as a construct or a way of affiliating anymore?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. That's very thoughtful. I really appreciate the reflections. And of course, I draw on a lot of work from yourself and as well as the people in your cohort. I would say that in brief, community still exists in the influencer space, certainly in the TikTok space, but it's changed. And there are a lot of ways this has changed. So I'll highlight just two. The first, I think traditionally when we read through all the canon in grad school and online communities, there is a belief that people are held together by affiliation, a positive emotion, or something that binds them together that they enjoy. But in the influencer space, if we're talking about the late 2010s to right now, a lot of the community we see are actually bounded by hating, coming together for a negative emotion, or coming together in brief periods because they're up for antagonizing. So it's still a community in the sense of the organization and the logics, but the emotionality, the affects have really changed. Some of the biggest communities of influencers that are online, especially in the UK, are online hating forums where thousands of people log into chats every other hour and come together to like tear apart any influencer's picture or video. That is still a community, but not in that nice Care Bear feeling FX sense. The second point I would say is the idea of community has also shifted out of mainstream focus. Some of the biggest groups, again, that I've studied are number in the thousands, but they survive in chat groups like Telegram. A lot of the back-end organization of community are in closed groups, locked platforms, so they're not visible for everyone to audience or spectate. But within their groups, they feel a sense of community. Again, this lends itself back to the idea of refracted publics, where they're not advertising themselves for you to come and join them. It's like, if you know, you will discover us and someone will bring you down this rabbit hole. And that's sort of like a self-filtering process for them to work out inside or outside the groups.
That's so interesting. I guess since I'm not seeing people jumping into the chat, I'm going to continue to monopolize. And Michael, you should feel free to jump in since we are getting close to our time. But I guess I would love to hear your reflections. I mean, I know a lot of folks in this community have sort of a learning and youth development focus and are trying to understand how we can meet young people where they are, or, connect with popular and influencer culture for positive youth development and learning. Do you have any advice on how that might happen? I know that that's not your core focus for a lot of your work, but I'm just really curious where, even though it's clearly important as a researcher to kind of view and sort of identify the good, bad, and ugly of internet culture, like where would you see sort of hope for educators and parents and young people in the space that you've been looking at?
Yeah, there's actually big T teaching and big E education happening on TikTok. We'll start off with, all the amazing teachers who are in that space, especially to gain rapport with their middle schoolers or their primary schoolers, because that's where they are. My colleague Trevor Buffone just had a book come out a couple of weeks ago looking at Renegade and TikTok dances, connecting to his work with Black American teens as well as Hispanic American teens, and how he used that space to connect with them, not just in terms of rapport building, but also meaning making. Why are you finding meaning in this when you might be coming out of poverty or struggling elsewhere? So there are educators who are not just branding themselves and then putting research out there and disseminating it, like a lot of us were trained to do on Twitter, but using that as a space to engage with their students. There's also further work done by some of my colleagues at the University of Zurich, where they were interrogating what they call science TikTok. How relevant is it that TikTok is a space to dispel conspiracy theories about pregnancy tests, vaccines, and a lot of the stereotypes that really are rampant on spots like Facebook and Twitter? They did a batch of tests around different types of genres, and they were trying to figure out the fidelity. What sticks, what kinds of messages, what kinds of visuality, and in so doing, hoping to assist people who work in science communications to also onboard their contents into these spaces where they're keyboard conspiracy theorists. But I would say the best thing about TikTok is there's so much peer education. You don't actually have to be a teacher or a professor or a doctor to teach. In fact, sometimes the young people frown on that. They're like, don't come here with your authority, go with your verified badge in some other platform. In fact, as I said before, the younger you are, the more on the fringes you are, the more complex your intersectional demographic might be. People are more willing to listen to you and lend you the space to hear your voice. And if you get through the right rabbit holes, I think it's a very amazing space just to hear from everyday people and learn from peer education. So for me, it's changed the structure from top-down dissemination, like we do on Twitter when we fight for retweets, or on YouTube, and it's made it very equal in that everyone gets to speak, and there will be someone out there listening.
Yeah, no, I love that about TikTok too, and I'm so glad you pointed to it, because there's aspects of TikTok that feel like, oh my God, I feel so old and so different in how it works. But then there's something very nostalgic about the return to the everydayness that I'd really missed in, that maybe the second wave of the internet, when the big, celebrities and politicians like started populating Twitter and Facebook. There's something about the popularity of like the quotidian and mundane that feels very nostalgic to me. So I appreciate your pointing that out.
Oh, I need to share this anecdote from fieldwork. I was also interviewing TikTokers across the East Asian market when it first hit their shores, because that was last in 2019 when we spoke. And some of my favorite influencers who were exploring TikTok, they showed me, this is what my background looks like when I'm doing an Instagram live. And they would really decorate it, make sure it's beautiful. And then this is what my background would look like if I'm doing TikTok. And they showed me how they picked out laundry from the basket and threw it on the floor to appear relatable and comfortable, because that was the vernacular in action on TikTok, where if you're picture perfect and pristine, this is the post Instagram bubble. It's not for you. We want to come here with our feelings and just be together in our inadequacies. And these were coming from influencers in their late 20s to early 30s who very clearly knew they needed to learn youth vernacular in order to break into that space.
Yeah. Well, that's a great example. Well, thank you, Crystal. I'm going to hand it over to Michael to close us out here.
Thank you so much, Mimi, and thanks for that really fantastic keynote, Crystal. I really think that the work that you're doing on TikTok is incredibly important. You're leading not just work of your own, but you're leading a community now, as you mentioned, and it's so informative and such important work in the area that we should all be taking note of. So thank you again. So I just wanted to finish our session today by thanking some people actually and providing you with some information. So if you want to, you're able to follow this session by joining. I'm just trying to get my screen to work correctly here. You can join Crystal for a short period of time in a discussion room if you'd like. So you just need to follow the link to do that, or you can go to the Farewell Lounge to join others there if you'd like to catch up. For those of us in the Australia-Asia time zone, this is the last time we will be meeting synchronously during the summit. And so I wanted to end with some information, and I wanted to say some thank yous. So first of all, I wanted to say how wonderful it has been to meet a host of new people from around the world during the summit, to hear about your brilliant work and to make new connections. And we'd like to invite people to complete a survey. So you can see the link on the here, and we'll also I'm providing that link in the chat as well. So there's the survey link, and yeah, you can just click on it in the chat there. Secondly, I'd like to Summit's organisers, the Connected Learning Network, the MIT Scheller Teacher Education Program, and the Learning Games Network. And I would particularly like to reinforce just how grateful we are to the organisers for providing this additional time zone to make it easier for people in this part of the world to participate. It's obviously one of the challenges right now with not being able to go to live conferences is being able to join into international conferences and not having to do that at sort of 2 o'clock in the morning. So we're very, very thankful for that consideration from the organisers. A wide group of people has contributed to the planning for this summit, as you can see from this slide, and we'd like to thank everyone for their contributions. And a special thank you, a special thank you for the tireless efforts of the UCI and MIT staff, who you can see on the screen right now. They've been superhuman in their efforts behind the scenes to make sure that everything has run well throughout the summit. And of course, we would not have pulled this off without the assistance of our volunteers, whose names you can see here. So thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you all for joining us. So we are now going to, in just a short minute, we're going to move across to either the discussion room with Crystal or to the Farewell Lounge. And so we'll see you there in a couple of minutes. So thank you very much.
Julie, do we stay here, or do we get put automatically in the discussion room? Is that what happens next?
I just posted in the chat 2 links to,
Okay.
Yeah, there it is. Now the continuation popped up, but you can also follow the link. If you do that continuation, it'll still make you wait another minute and a half.
I see.
But if you click the link in the chat, it'll take you there now.
Got it. Thank you.